All right, welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about incident response. This video is going to be broken up into a couple of different parts because incident response is a pretty big topic. So, this first video, we're really just going to get into what is incident response. We're not going to dive too deep into any individual section. I like keeping these videos shorter and consumable because I don't have the attention span for super long videos, so I assume you don't either. But here, let's keep this broken up, but check out the other parts after this. But here we go. So, what is incident response? Before we can kind of dive into what is incident response, we really need to understand what an incident is. And while every organization might define an incident differently, most generally agree that an incident is a confirmed or highly confident probability that a non authorized party has successfully accessed a system they shouldn't have or is doing something to negatively impact the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a system, right? So, not every alarm we get from our SIM is an incident necessarily. Sometimes we get alarms and we realize they're false positives. Sometimes we get alarms and we're not really sure what it is. Sometimes we get an alarm and we say, yep, that's definitely a bad thing. When we see the yup, definitely it's a bad thing, and we need to start doing something with it, generally that's when an organization will consider what you're dealing with an incident. If you're seeing a bunch of stuff and you're like, that's super weird, we need to investigate this further, a lot of organizations will consider that an incident because you're past the point of your initial triaging, and now you really have to continue looking into what's going on. So you really want to kick off that incident response process and engage the incident response teams, so if it's something bad, you can start actioning those items. Now, if we look at the phases of an intrusion kill chain, an incident is usually somewhere right around the delivery phase, is the first time you'll see it. Now, you can probably see a lot of the reconnaissance steps, right? You might see port scans, you might see things like that, but generally in the reconnaissance phases, you're not calling it an incident yet because, frankly, that stuff just happens a lot. Now, if we were to say, yep, it's an incident every time we see a port scan, we would never be out of incident response mode, frankly. It just as part of life living on the internet, right? And the weaponization phase isn't something we have access to. That's something an attacker generally does on their side of the world. So, what we're really reacting to is the delivery of something. We see that USB drive get plugged in and a malicious piece of software kick off from it. We see somebody following the phishing link in that email and going through and clicking in and entering their credentials where they shouldn't have. Those are the start of an incident that we can generally see in our detection capabilities, right? Um, if you're not so good at detecting some of those things, you might not see this until the installation. Some organizations, if they don't really have a lot of good detection, might even miss things like command and control entirely, right? They might not see beaconing and things like that. So, where you get that your detection from will vary based on your organization. Ideally, you want to get it as close to the top of this list as possible because bad things just continually happen the closer to the bottom you get, obviously. So incidents tend to kick off right around that delivery phase. Although in your incident response, when you're going through and you're digging in to kind of do your investigation, you might start seeing some of that reconnaissance activity, even if you didn't respond to it initially. So, who participates in incident response, right? Um, Generally, during an incident response, you're going to see a handful of roles kind of start appearing. You have your incident commander, or you should, and that's the person who is designated to run and manage the incident as a whole. Now, in different organizations, this could be a different person. In some organizations, it's the CISO, right? It's the CIO. It's somebody who's very high up at an executive level who has a lot of accountability and ownership over the security of the organization. They may designate themselves as the incident commander for all incidents. I've seen this in really large organizations and really small organizations. Sometimes it's because they're just the most well trained and most well equipped. Sometimes it's because they just think that they're the most accountable and therefore they want to be engaged. And the most active engaged person is the incident commander. In other organizations that have true incident response teams and dedicated people for this kind of stuff, you'll usually have somebody who's trained as an incident response commander, and their job is to just manage incidents. In some organizations, the incident response commander isn't even specific to security incidents. They may have a group that is incident response as a whole, and they may be responsible for things like outages, physical security issues, cybersecurity issues, internet outages, or production outages if you're in an environment that produces or delivers some kind of service. So it just depends, company by company and role by role, sort of. But what the important takeaway here is, you should have an incident commander defined and assigned, right? Like, without an incident commander, you don't want to be trying to figure out who's in charge mid investigation. You got to have that kind of nailed down in your incident response plan. Generally, your SIM engineers will be engaged. These are the people who are responsible for the log collection of your organization typically. So you want somebody from that team around, available to help with either adding additional logging if you don't have the available resources. It's not the best time to turn logging on, but it's better than never. You want people who are experts in the tooling in case there's questions about how to find stuff, where data is coming from, making sure the integrity of that data is legitimate. You have your SOC analysts, right? These are the people whose job it is to figure out what's going on in these logs. They're often the ones who threw the flag initially that said, hey, this is an incident. We need to start working on it. So you have people like that. You might have system administrators. These are the technical resources that are responsible for the systems that might be impacted, right? So your SOC analyst might be saying, hey, I see something goofy going on this file server. You probably have a file systems administrator who's in charge of that file server who's saying, hey, these are what these permissions are. This is the kind of data that's on there. Or you might have like a web application specialist who's in charge of your web servers or something along those lines. Data owners. These are often the non-technical owners of the data. So who is in charge of the business unit that's impacted most by this incident? Are we turning down a web server? What does that web server do? Is it internal use? Is it external use? What kind of data does it have? You want these people engaged because they can help you understand the risk to your organization and the impact. That way, as you make decisions on how to isolate stuff when we get to those steps, you know who you're working with and what data you're working with. You understand what the impact is and what an attacker might even be after. You might have third party incident responders. A lot of organizations, even ones with really good information security teams, hire third parties for incident response because incident response is hard, and it's specialized, frankly, right? Like, if your security is tight, you may not fall into an incident more, but maybe once a year if you're lucky. Maybe even less often than that. So having a team that's really honed in on the idea of incident response is hard unless you're practicing often. So you might have a contract with like Cisco Talos, with Black Hills, with CrowdStrike, with Mandiant, any of these organizations that have professional services based incident response groups. You can hire them. They'll help you develop your IR plan, and if something bad pops off that your team can't really handle, you give them a call. They drop in an incident commander for you, and they bring their team online to help you start guiding that investigation. You also probably need some contact lists for your vendors. If it's an area of your network that is compromised, that's managed by a vendor, or that is vendor dependent, having people from their team that can access the different areas of that vendor application or those vendor system appliances is useful. And then you might have some other specializations, right? There's obviously going to be forensics people if you need to collect those kinds of logs or things like that. And there's miscellaneous other rules, but these are kind of the main people you're going to end up talking to. And really, it's important to understand this because one of the worst things that can happen during incident response is a breakdown of communication and momentum because people don't know who's asking them for stuff or why, right? So, say you're a system administrator and you get woken up at 2 a.m. And some random person calls you and says, hey, I need these guys to have immediate access to your file server. You're going to say, yeah, it's 2 a.m. Maybe put in a request in our ticketing system. We'll get that sorted on Monday. And that would suck if you didn't know that person was an incident commander during an incident, and you didn't know the people being that were requesting access for were that third party incident response people. The delays in getting these things sorted during an emergency really slow down momentum. And if it's a real emergency where an attacker is moving quickly and you really need to act, those kinds of things can kill your incident response. So let's take a high level of what incident response kind of looks like, the phases of it, and then we'll wrap up this video. And in the future videos, we'll dive into each one of these phases individually. But this is the SANS incident response cycle, right? It starts with preparation. So hopefully that's what you're doing right now. You're learning a little bit about incident response. You're learning who needs to be engaged, what the steps are for incident response. You're practicing it, right? We move into an identification stage. So we're trying to understand what's happening. We're learning what's been compromised. We're looking for scopes. We're looking at containment steps next. So how do we limit the damage? How do we start breaking things down, right? How do we start segmenting environments and isolating where maybe an attacker is? We look at eradication. That's where we get the bad guys out of our network finally, right? We make it secure. We can start recovering data after that. And then we sync up with that lessons learned and we say, okay, where did this go right? Where did this go wrong? Who was prepared? Who wasn't? What tools were we missing that would have made our lives easier? And then we circle back again, right? Once we have some lessons learned, we prepare all over again. Um, So that's incident response kind of in a nutshell. The next few videos we do, we're going to really deep dive into each one of these segments. We'll talk a little bit about more about them. But remember, preparation is step one. So get started. Yeah, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great night, everybody.